The war maps never lied. Marcus Thornfield had learned that truth in the jungles of Vietnam, relearned it across 3 centuries of vampire conflicts. And now, at 2 in the morning on a Tuesday in March, he stood over a table spread with the reconnaissance photos that told him everything except what he needed to know. The Blackthorn clan was moving troops toward the eastern border. 17 compounds fortified in the past month. Supply lines established through human-controlled territories where his scouts couldn't follow without risking exposure. Classic encirclement tactics, the kind Marcus himself had used to win the Battle of Crescent Ridge in 1847. He dragged a hand across his face. The stubble there would never grow thicker frozen at the exact length it had been the night Elara found him bleeding out in a Saigon alley. October 1968. 57 years ago, though, his reflection still showed the same 23-year-old Marine corporal who'd stepped on a mine that should have killed him. Would have killed him if the Queen Mother hadn't been hunting in the city that night, if she hadn't smelled his blood and seen something worth saving. The maps blurred. Marcus blinked hard, realizing he had been staring at the same coordinates for 20 minutes without processing a single detail. This happened more often lately. His mind would slip its leash and drag him backward through memories he'd rather leave buried. Catherine dancing in their courtyard under cherry blossoms she'd planted herself. Catherine laughing as she tried to teach him to waltz, his combat boots crushing her toes every third step. Catherine in the birthing room, her hand crushing his with human strength that faded to nothing as Gabriel drew his first silent breath and she drew her last. The pen in Marcus's hand snapped. Ink bled across the reconnaissance photo, obscuring enemy positions. He swore under his breath and reached for a cloth, then stopped. Let it bleed. Let the whole goddamn map drown in ink. What difference did it make? He'd won every battle that mattered and lost the only war worth fighting. His study door stood open. Marcus didn't remember opening it, but he often didn't these days. Sleep deprivation played tricks even on vampire minds. He could hear the palace settling around him, ancient timbers contracting in the Pacific Northwest, cold guards changing shift in distant corridors, kitchen staff beginning breakfast preparations 3 floors down. And beneath it all, softer than breath, the sound he'd trained himself to ignore, Gabriel's heartbeat steady in small 2 chambers and a locked doorway. Marcus crossed to the window. Thornfield Palace rose from old-growth forest like a cathedral built by madmen, all Gothic spires and modern steel hidden behind facades of weathered stone. The human world knew this stretch of the Cascade Mountains as protected wilderness too remote and rugged for development. They never questioned the private road that led nowhere on their maps, never wondered about the lights that burned in windows. No satellite could quite resolve. Vampire glamour handled the rest, a collective suggestion that bent perception just enough to make humans look elsewhere. Think of something else. Remember, they had urgent business in Seattle or Portland or anywhere but here. Dawn was still 3 hours away. Marcus could feel the approaching sun like a headache building behind his eyes, though he was old enough that daylight merely exhausted him rather than burned. He'd seen younger vampires combust from carelessness, had lost good soldiers to tactical mistakes that involved too much confidence and too little respect for the star that had warmed his human childhood. These days, he rarely saw the sun at all. Easier to sleep through it, work through the night, avoid the windows that framed a world Catherine would never see again. A folder lay on his desk, hand-delivered by Steward Richard before midnight. Marcus had been ignoring it for 2 hours. He finally picked it up, knowing what he'd find inside. The spring procession was 6 weeks away. Ancient tradition demanded the royal family appear before their people, accept blessings, demonstrate the strength and continuity of the Thornfield line. For 300 years, Marcus had stood on that balcony and played his part. For the past 7 years, he'd done it alone. Gabriel kept carefully out of sight because a mute air raised too many questions Marcus didn't want to answer. This year's planning documents included a note in Richard's precise handwriting. Perhaps the prince might attend. He asks about it often. Marcus closed the folder. Gabriel asked about many things, asked in the language of hands. Marcus had never bothered to learn asking questions his father couldn't understand and therefore couldn't answer. Easier not to try, easier to nod and smile and leave the boy to his tutors, his books, his silent courtyard where he spent hours watching birds and arranging stones into patterns that probably meant something if you knew how to read them. The clock on Marcus's desk read 2:47 a.m. He should sleep, should try at least. Instead, he found himself in the corridor boots, soundless on Persian runners that had cost more than a suburban house. Palace security knew better than to question their king's wandering. The night guards simply nodded as he passed, their faces carefully neutral. Gabriel's wing occupied the eastern tower, Catherine's choice, because she'd loved how morning light painted the stone walls gold. Marcus hadn't set foot here in months. He told himself it was respect for his son's privacy. Told himself the boy needed space. Told himself a dozen lies that tasted like ash. The door to Gabriel's bedroom stood ajar. Marcus stopped in the hallway, hand raised to knock, then simply watched through the gap. His son sat cross-legged on the floor in pajamas printed with dinosaurs, surrounded by picture books open to random pages. The boy's hands moved in the lamplight, fingers forming shapes Marcus didn't recognize. Practicing, Marcus realized. Gabriel was practicing conversations with an audience of no, one his small face serious with concentration as he signed to empty air. Something in Marcus's chest fractured. Not broke because it had broken 2 years ago in a birthing room slick with blood. This was smaller, quieter. The sound a foundation makes when it finally admits the weight above is too much to bear. He pulled back before Gabriel could sense him watching, retreated to his study, poured whiskey he wouldn't taste and couldn't get drunk on. Sat in Catherine's chair because his own felt too large, too cold, too much like a throne, when all he wanted was to be a man who knew how to talk to his son. The sky beyond his window had begun its slow shift toward gray when Steward Richard knocked. 3 precise raps that meant business couldn't wait for civilized hours. Richard was human, 73 years old, and had run Thornfield Palace since before Marcus claimed the throne. The old man's face showed no judgment as he took in the scattered maps, the broken pen, the king who hadn't changed clothes in 3 days. Marcus gestured him in without speaking. Richard set a silver tray on the desk. Coffee black, the good Guatemalan beans Catherine had loved. Toast with honey, because Richard remembered Marcus hadn't eaten since yesterday's council session. The steward poured added nothing and presented the cup with the same careful dignity he'd shown every morning for 30 years. Marcus took it. The coffee was perfect. It always was. Richard's weathered hands folded behind his back in a posture that was pure military, despite him never having served. He waited patient as stone for Marcus to acknowledge the real reason for his visit. Marcus set down the cup. The words came harder than they should have. Tell me about the waitress, the one from last month's hiring. If Richard was surprised, his face didn't show it. He never forgot a name, never needed to consult files. Emma Grace, Your Majesty, 22 years of age, originally from the eastern settlements near Cascade Locks, orphaned at 16, applied through the standard channels past all background investigations. She's been assigned to the main dining hall on variable shifts. Marcus turned the coffee cup in his hands, watching steam curl and dissipate. The background investigation. What did it show? Richard hesitated, which meant he knew exactly why Marcus was asking. She was primary caregiver for a younger brother from age 16 to 20. The boy was deaf. He passed 5 years ago from complications of pneumonia. Miss Grace learned American Sign Language to communicate with him. According to her references from Cascade Locks, she was quite devoted to the child. The coffee had gone cold. Marcus drank it anyway. Assign her to Gabriel's morning detail. Breakfast service to the eastern courtyard, starting tomorrow. Richard's expression remained neutral, but something shifted behind his eyes. Not disapproval, something closer to relief. A promotion from general dining service to the royal wing is unusual for someone with only 3 months' experience, sire. The other staff may question. Marcus cut him off with a look that had ended arguments for 3 centuries. Then let them question quietly. Make the assignment, that's all. Richard bowed and withdrew, taking the coffee tray and leaving Marcus alone with dawn beginning to bleed through the windows and the memory of his son's hands forming words in empty air, practicing conversations he'd never have with the one person he most wanted to hear them. Marcus didn't sleep. Instead, he pulled out a locked drawer in his desk, one Richard knew never to clean or organize. Inside lay a painted miniature no larger than his palm. Catherine held baby Gabriel, both of them laughing at something beyond the frame. The artist had captured the exact shade of her eyes, that particular gray-green that reminded Marcus of Pacific Northwest forests after rain. Gabriel's eyes were the same color, would always be the same color, a daily reminder of everything Marcus had loved and failed to protect. He closed the drawer, locked it, sat watching the sun rise over the mountains that had stood here long before vampires claimed them and would stand long after all of them turned to dust. The spring banquet preparations consumed the palace for the next 3 weeks. Marcus attended the necessary planning sessions, approved budgets, reviewed security protocols, and tried not to notice how often the discussions included careful references to the prince's accommodation and appropriate seating that respects his condition, as if muteness were a disease requiring quarantine rather than simply how Gabriel existed in the world. Theodore Blackwood cornered Marcus after one such meeting, his weathered face creased with the kind of concern that made Marcus want to punch walls. Theodore had been Marcus's second-in-command for longer than most nations had existed. They'd fought together, bled together, built this kingdom from the ashes of vampire civil war. Theodore had held Marcus upright at Catherine's funeral when grief had made standing impossible, which meant Theodore thought he'd earned the right to speak freely about things that were absolutely none of his goddamn business. They stood in the portrait gallery surrounded by painted faces of Thornfield ancestors Marcus had never met, but whose legacy he'd inherited through violence and political necessity. Evening light through stained glass turned Theodore's silver hair into something almost holy. Theodore's voice stayed low-pitched for Marcus's ears alone, despite the corridor being empty. The boy will be at the banquet. Not a question. Marcus focused on a portrait of Queen Alara the Founder, her painted eyes seeming to judge him from across 2 centuries. Gabriel is always invited to formal functions. Theodore's jaw tightened in that particular way that meant he was choosing his words with surgical care. Invited, yes. Present, rarely. The council expects him to attend this year. Some of them are asking questions. Marcus turned to face his oldest friend, letting cold authority settle over his features like armor he'd worn so long it felt like skin. What kind of questions? Theodore held his gaze, refusing to flinch. The kind that wonder whether an heir who cannot speak can effectively rule. The kind that notice you keep him hidden away like a secret you're ashamed of. The kind that suggest if the prince is unfit, perhaps succession should be reconsidered. The corridor temperature dropped several degrees. Marcus didn't raise his voice. Didn't need to. Gabriel is my son and the rightful heir to the Thornfield throne. Anyone who suggests otherwise can present their concerns to me directly, preferably in the combat circle where we can discuss their theories about fitness to rule. Theodore didn't retreat. Decades of friendship had made him immune to intimidation. I'm not your enemy, Marcus. I'm trying to prevent you from making a mistake that will hurt that boy more than hiding him already has. The words landed like a blade between ribs, precise and devastating. Marcus felt his hands curl into fists, old combat reflexes screaming at him to strike, to fight to solve this problem the way he'd solved every other problem for 3 centuries. Instead, he forced his voice level, cold as the stone walls surrounding them. Gabriel will attend the banquet. He'll sit at the high table. Anything else? Theodore studied him with eyes that had seen too much and forgotten nothing. Do you even know what he sounds like when he signs, when he's excited or scared, or trying to tell you something important? Marcus turned away, done with this conversation, done with the judgment in Theodore's face. I know what I need to know. Theodore's voice followed him down the corridor. Do you? Because from where I stand, you know nothing about your son except how to avoid him. Marcus kept walking, let the accusation hang in the air like smoke. Let Theodore think whatever he wanted. The man had buried his own child 50 years ago, had watched his son Adrian suffer through a decade of deteriorating health before death came as mercy. Theodore thought that gave him moral authority to judge Marcus's parenting. Thought grief created some kind of fellowship that erased the difference between losing a child to illness and losing a wife to childbirth while the child survived. But Adrian had been able to speak, had been able to tell his father he loved him, was scared, wanted one more story before sleep. Gabriel's silence was different. Gabriel's silence was a wall Marcus had no tools to breach and no map to navigate. So yes, he avoided it. Avoided him. Avoided the constant reminder that Catherine had died bringing Gabriel into the world, and Marcus still didn't know if the trade had been worth it. The thought made him sick. Made him the kind of father who deserved Theodore's judgment, and worse. But knowing it was wrong didn't make it less true, and truth was the one enemy Marcus had never learned to defeat. The night of the spring banquet arrived with the weight of an execution. Marcus, dressed in formal armor, black steel worked with silver that caught candlelight like captured stars. The crown settled on his head, heavy as regret. He studied himself in the mirror and saw a king, a warrior, a man who'd conquered nations but couldn't manage a conversation with a 7-year-old. Catherine would have known what to do. Catherine would have learned sign language the first week, would have filled Gabriel's world with laughter and stories and the kind of effortless love that Marcus had somehow forgotten how to feel. She'd been protesting the Vietnam War when they met, had thrown red paint on his dress uniform during a rally in San Francisco. He'd been home on leave, confused and angry, and she'd been fearless in a way that made his heart stop. 3 months later, they were married. 5 years later, she chose vampirism to stay with him forever. Forever had lasted 43 years. Marcus descended to the Great Hall where 500 guests already mingled beneath chandeliers that cost more than most humans earned in a lifetime. Vampire aristocracy in their finest clothing, human dignitaries in tuxedos and gowns, all of them performing the careful dance of a society built on secrets and maintained through collective agreement to pretend everything was normal. The high table sat on a raised platform at the hall's northern end. Marcus's throne dominated the center, flanked by seats for honored guests and family. Gabriel's chair was smaller positioned to Marcus's right, currently empty. Richard had assured him the boy was being prepared by his attendants would arrive shortly. Marcus took his place. Let the ritual wash over him. Toasts were raised, speeches delivered. The musicians in the corner played something classical that Catherine would have known the name of. Marcus nodded and smiled and played the part of the gracious host while his mind counted minutes until this performance could end. Then Gabriel arrived and every other thought evaporated. The boy wore miniature formal robes that matched Marcus's own black and silver, impossibly small. His dark hair had been carefully combed. His face was pale, eyes huge with nervousness as an attendant guided him toward the high table. The crowd's conversation didn't exactly stop, but it shifted, dropped to whispers that carried farther than shouts. Gabriel's gaze found Marcus. The boy's hands started to rise, forming the beginning of a sign, then dropped back to his sides when he remembered his father wouldn't understand. Couldn't understand. Had never tried to understand because trying meant admitting there was something worth understanding, and Marcus had spent 2 years telling himself the silence didn't matter. The lie was getting harder to sustain. Gabriel reached the high table and bowed, formal and perfect, exactly as his tutors had taught him. Marcus nodded in return, the gesture wooden inadequate. An attendant helped Gabriel into his seat. The boy sat perfectly still, small hands folded in his lap like wounded birds, while conversation resumed around him, and he became invisible despite being the only child in a room of immortals. Marcus forced himself to eat, forced himself to engage in discussions with the nobles seated nearby, forced himself not to look at Gabriel's untouched plate the way the boy's shoulders curved inward, as if trying to make himself even smaller. The wine service began. Waitstaff circulated through the crowd with silver trays and crystal goblets. Marcus tracked them, automatically old combat instincts that never fully shut down. Threats could come from anywhere. Poison was a favorite tool among vampire assassins because it worked on humans and young vampires alike. He'd lost friends that way, back when he had friends he hadn't already buried. One of the waitresses approaching the high table caught his attention. Young, maybe early 20s with dark hair, pulled back in the severe style palace protocol demanded. She carried her tray with careful concentration, navigating between tables with the kind of focus that suggested this was still new enough to be terrifying. Marcus recognized her face from Richard's report, though he'd never formally met her. Emma Grace, the girl who'd learned to sign so her brother wouldn't die alone. She reached the high table and began serving, starting with Lord Castellan, 3 seats to Marcus's left. Her hands trembled slightly as she poured. Standard first-time nerves, nothing to worry about. Then another server rushed past too fast, carrying an empty tray back toward the kitchens. The man's shoulder clipped Emma's elbow. Physics and bad timing did the rest. The tray tilted. 3 crystal goblets slid toward the edge in what felt like slow motion. Emma's eyes went wide, her hand darting out, too late to catch them. The glasses tumbled through candlelight, spinning and separating beautiful and terrible. They crashed directly in front of Gabriel. Red wine exploded across white linen like arterial spray. Crystal shattered pieces skittering across the table. One shard landed inches from Gabriel's hand. The entire hall went silent. 500 conversations died mid-sentence. Forks froze. Musicians in the corner stopped playing the final note hanging in air like a held breath. Marcus saw Emma drop to her knees, the words already spilling from her mouth in a terrified rush. She was apologizing, begging forgiveness, her face white with the certainty that she'd just ended her career and possibly her life. Palace servants had been executed for less. Everyone knew the stories, but Marcus wasn't looking at Emma. He was looking at Gabriel. The boy hadn't flinched when the glasses shattered, hadn't cried out because he couldn't. He simply stared at the mess with dark eyes that were too familiar. Too much like Catherine's, reflecting the same fear Marcus had seen the night she died, when the midwife's expression changed and blood began pooling where it shouldn't. Emma was still apologizing, her voice breaking. Then her hands moved. It happened so fast, Marcus almost missed it. Emma's hands came up in a fluid gesture, fingers forming shapes Marcus didn't recognize. Her face shifted from terrified to concerned. Her eyes locked on Gabriel with the kind of focus that said she'd forgotten the 500 witnesses and was seeing only the scared child in front of her. Gabriel's head snapped up. His eyes met Emma's, and his entire face transformed. Marcus had forgotten his son could smile like that, had forgotten the exact shape of joy on Gabriel's features, the way his eyes crinkled at the corners, the way 7 years old could look young again, instead of weighed down by silences too heavy for small shoulders. Gabriel's hands flew up from his lap. His fingers blurred through signs too quick for Marcus to separate into individual shapes, even if he'd known what to look for. But Gabriel's expression said everything. Excitement, disbelief, desperate hope finally answered. Emma signed back her movements slower, more careful. Gabriel responded faster, leaning forward in his chair, nearly vibrating with energy. The conversation lasted maybe 10 seconds. To Marcus, it felt like watching something sacred through glass, something private he had no right to witness. Then Gabriel smiled again, wider this time, and signed something that made Emma's face soften with the kind of gentle understanding Marcus hadn't seen directed at his son since Catherine died. Silence. Marcus heard his own voice cut through the hall before he consciously decided to speak. The word came out harder than he intended, sharp as broken glass. Every head turned, every spine straightened. 500 people remembering simultaneously that they were in the presence of a king who could end lives with a word. Emma's smile vanished. She dropped her gaze to the floor, hands falling to her sides, the light going out of her like a snuffed candle. Gabriel's hands froze mid-sign. The joy slid from his face, replaced by that terrible stillness Marcus knew too well. The boy's eyes dropped to his lap. His shoulders curled inward, making him smaller than he already was. Marcus rose from his throne. The movement was pure reflex, the warrior in him responding to threat before his mind could identify what he was threatening or why. He unfolded to his full-height armor, catching candlelight, crown heavy on his brow. He wasn't looking at Emma, he was looking at his son. At the way Gabriel had just gone from more animated than Marcus had seen in months to completely shut down in the space between heartbeats. At the reminder that Marcus's voice, Marcus's presence, Marcus's existence was apparently enough to extinguish whatever light Emma had managed to kindle. The hall held its breath. Marcus became aware of the spectacle he was creating. 500 people watching him loom over a terrified waitress who'd committed the crime of spilling wine and the apparently greater crime of making his son happy. He forced himself to shift his attention to Emma. She knelt on the floor, head bowed, shaking. Probably convinced she was about to die. Probably wondering if begging would help or just draw out the inevitable. Marcus's voice came out quieter than his first command, but it carried through the silence like thunder. You stand. Emma rose on unsteady legs. She kept her eyes down proper and terrified and utterly unaware that she'd just accomplished something Marcus had failed to do for 7 years. She'd spoken to his son, actually spoken in a language Gabriel understood, and Gabriel had responded not with the careful politeness he showed his tutors, but with genuine excitement. She'd done in 5 seconds what Marcus couldn't do in 7 years. The realization hit him like a blade between ribs. Marcus heard himself ask the question, even as part of him screamed that this was a mistake, that he should dismiss her and move on and pretend tonight had never happened. Where did you learn that? His voice sounded strange even to his own ears. Not angry, confused maybe, lost. Emma's voice shook when she answered. In my village, Your Majesty. My brother was born deaf. I learned to speak with my hands so he wouldn't be alone. She'd learned so her brother wouldn't be alone. The phrase lodged in Marcus's mind like shrapnel. So simple, so devastating. As if loneliness were an injury you could prevent with effort and care instead of something inevitable, something Marcus had convinced himself Gabriel had to endure because there was no alternative. Except apparently there was. Apparently the alternative was standing in front of him, terrified and shaking, having just demonstrated it. Marcus made himself ask the next question, even though he already knew the answer, and it would hurt. Your brother, where is he now? Emma's voice dropped to barely a whisper. Dead silent. 5 years ago. Something flickered across Marcus's face. An emotion he couldn't name and couldn't control. He glanced back at Gabriel. The boy was watching them with desperate, pleading eyes that begged Marcus not to punish Emma for being kind. Those eyes were so much like Catherine's, it physically hurt to meet them. The crowd waited. Protocol demanded he respond somehow. Punish the server for her clumsiness, or at minimum dismiss her in disgrace. Anything less would look weak, would suggest the king could be moved by sentiment, by the human stories his servants carried like scars. Marcus turned to Richard, who stood near the throne with the patience of someone who'd weathered 300 years of royal decisions, both brilliant and catastrophic. Find this woman's name and posting. Report to my study within the hour. He returned to his seat without another word. The musicians began playing again, tentative at first, then with growing confidence. Conversations resumed. Servants rushed forward to clean the spilled wine and broken crystal. The machinery of the banquet ground back into motion as if nothing had happened. But Gabriel's eyes stayed on Emma as she was ushered away by a senior server. The boy's hands moved one final time, small and quick, hidden beneath the table, where only Marcus could see because he sat right next to his son and for once in 7 years was actually paying attention. Marcus didn't know the sign, but he recognized gratitude when he saw it written across a child's face. Emma was gone. The banquet continued. Gabriel sat silent and still for the rest of the evening, but something had changed in his posture. His shoulders weren't quite so curved. His face wasn't quite so defeated, as if someone had reminded him that he existed, that he mattered, that his language was real and worth speaking. Marcus made it through the rest of the banquet on autopilot. He smiled. He nodded. He performed the role of gracious host while his mind replayed those 10 seconds over and over. Gabriel's transformation. Emma's casual competence with sign language. The reminder that Marcus's son had a whole vocabulary, a whole way of existing in the world that Marcus had simply decided wasn't worth his time to learn. The shame was old and familiar and getting harder to ignore. The banquet ended near midnight. Marcus waited in his study while Richard conducted whatever investigation was required for a formal personnel report. The old steward arrived precisely 1 hour after Marcus's command, carrying a leather folder and wearing an expression that suggested he knew exactly what was coming and had already made his peace with it. Richard set the folder on Marcus's desk and opened it to reveal a single page. Emma Grace's employment record thinned because she'd only been at the palace 3 months. Photo attached showing a young woman with serious eyes and dark hair pulled back. She looked older than 22 in the picture. Life did that to people. Orphaned at 16, caring for a dying brother, working whatever job she could find. The kind of life that carved experience into your face before your time. Marcus scanned the page. References from Cascade Locks described her as reliable, hardworking, devoted to her brother's care until the end. One reference from a local church pastor noted that Emma had learned American Sign Language from the deaf community. There had been an active member of their social gatherings even after her brother's death. A young woman with uncommon empathy, the pastor had written. Marcus closed the folder. The sign language, how fluent is she? Richard had clearly anticipated the question. I took the liberty of consulting with Professor Hayes, who tutors Prince Gabriel. According to him, American Sign Language has regional variations, but the fundamentals remain consistent. Miss Grace learned from the Pacific Northwest deaf community, which means her signing would be comprehensible to the prince, though perhaps not as formal as Professor Hayes' academic approach. Marcus leaned back in his chair. The leather creaked under his weight. Assign her to the Eastern Wing, morning shift. Her duties will include breakfast service to Gabriel's courtyard. Richard's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes. Relief, maybe? Or vindication? A significant promotion for someone with minimal experience, Your Majesty. The other staff may question the reasoning. Marcus met his steward's gaze with the flat certainty that had ended countless arguments over countless years. Then they can question quietly, or they can find employment elsewhere. I don't particularly care which. Richard bowed, accepting the order without further comment. Will there be anything else, sire? Marcus almost dismissed him, almost let the conversation end there. But the image of Gabriel's hands moving in gratitude wouldn't leave his mind. The prince, when he signs, is it actual language, actual communication, or just gestures? The question revealed more ignorance than Marcus was comfortable admitting. Richard's expression softened with something that might have been pity if directed at anyone other than a king who could tear him apart without effort. American Sign Language is a complete language, Your Majesty. It has grammar, syntax, nuance. Professor Hayes has explained this before, though perhaps not recently. Hayes had explained it. Marcus remembered now vaguely a conversation years ago when they had first hired the tutor. Marcus had been dealing with border conflicts at the time, had only half listened to the explanation of how deaf education worked. He'd signed the contract, authorized payment, and assumed the problem was solved. Except Gabriel's silence wasn't a problem to be solved. It was a reality to be lived with, and Marcus had responded to it the way he responded to everything, by treating it as a tactical situation requiring minimum engagement. Richard was still standing there, waiting for dismissal. Marcus waved him away. That's all. Make the assignment effective tomorrow morning. After Richard left, Marcus sat alone in his study and tried to remember the last time he'd actually looked at Gabriel. Really looked, not just glanced over during formal dinners or nodded in passing when the boys' tutors paraded him through for inspection. Weeks at least, maybe longer. Time did strange things when you were immortal, and grief made hours feel like centuries. He pulled out the locked drawer. The miniature portrait felt heavier than it should. Catherine's painted eyes seemed to accuse him from across the distance of her death. Marcus spoke to the portrait even though he knew it was insane, knew Catherine was gone and couldn't hear him and wouldn't forgive him if she could. I don't know how to talk to him. I've commanded armies. I've negotiated treaties in 7 languages. But I can't figure out how to have a conversation with a 7-year-old who can't hear or speak. The portrait didn't answer. The painted Catherine kept smiling, kept holding baby Gabriel, kept existing in a moment of perfect joy that Marcus could remember but not recreate. He locked the drawer, sat in darkness until dawn painted the windows gray. Didn't let himself think about why he'd assigned Emma to Gabriel's detail or what he expected to accomplish by watching someone else succeed where he'd failed. The next morning, Marcus woke late, which meant 9 a.m. instead of his usual 5. He'd managed maybe 3 hours of actual sleep, the rest spent in that strange half-state where his mind churned through possibilities while his body went through the motions of rest. Vampire physiology meant he could function on minimal sleep indefinitely, but it made him irritable and more prone to mistakes. Richard had left a note on his desk confirming Emma's reassignment. She'd report to the Eastern Wing kitchen at dawn, would be responsible for Gabriel's breakfast service until further notice. The other kitchen staff had been informed. No questions asked, at least not to Richard's face. The Palace Gossip Network would be in full operation by now, spinning theories about why a junior waitress had suddenly been elevated to royal service after spilling wine on the prince. Let them gossip. Marcus had stopped caring about palace politics decades ago. He spent the morning in council meetings that blurred together into a monotonous drone of border tensions, trade negotiations, and internal disputes that somehow all required his personal attention, despite having advisors specifically hired to handle such things. Theodore was there, of course, watching Marcus with the kind of careful attention that said he knew something had shifted after last night's banquet, but couldn't quite identify what. Marcus ignored him, ignored everyone. Let his mind drift to the Eastern Wing where Emma would be delivering breakfast to a courtyard he hadn't visited in months. He wondered if Gabriel would be excited to see her. Wondered if they'd sign to each other, if his son's face would light up again the way it had last night. Wondered what it said about him as a father that he was using palace staff as intermediaries instead of learning to communicate with his own child. The thought made him feel sick. The council session dragged past noon. By the time Marcus escaped, the sun was high and fierce, burning through clouds to turn the forest canopy into a wall of painful green light. He retreated to his study and tried to focus on the Blackthorn intelligence reports that kept piling up. Troop movements, supply caches, diplomatic overtures from neutral clans asking if Thornfield was concerned about the military buildup. Of course he was concerned. The Blackthorn clan had been rivals for 2 centuries, ever since Lord Victor Blackthorn had challenged Marcus's right to rule and lost both the combat trial and his left eye in the process. Victor held grudges like vampires held on to life, eternally bitterly, waiting for any opportunity to even the score. But Marcus couldn't make himself care today. Couldn't focus on military strategy when part of his mind was elsewhere, wondering what Gabriel and Emma might be talking about in a courtyard Marcus had built for Catherine, and then abandoned because it hurt too much to visit. He gave up pretending to work around 2 p.m., told Richard he needed air, needed space, needed anything other than these 4 walls, and the weight of decisions he kept deferring because they required confronting truths he'd rather avoid. Marcus found himself walking toward the eastern wing without consciously deciding to go there. His feet knew the path, even if his mind had tried to forget it. Through the main corridor, past the portrait gallery, up the spiral stairs Catherine had insisted on because she loved how they curved like a nautilus shell. The architect had warned they'd be impractical for furniture movement. Catherine had laughed and said beauty was never practical. The door to Gabriel's courtyard stood open. Marcus stopped before reaching it, staying in the shadow of the archway where he could see without being seen. Old combat instincts made him good at observation, at gathering intelligence before committing to engagement. The courtyard was exactly as Catherine had designed it. Night-blooming flowers covered every surface, moonvines and shadow roses that should have closed with sunrise but somehow remained open. Here their petals luminescent even in daylight. A fountain burbled in the center, water crystal clear, despite Marcus never arranging for its maintenance. The palace staff must handle it. He'd never asked. Stone benches curved beneath a willow tree that wept silver leaves onto grass Catherine had transplanted from her childhood home in Oregon. She'd wanted Gabriel to have a place that felt alive, she'd said. A place where growing things could teach him that silence could be full of sound if you knew how to listen. Gabriel sat cross-legged on the grass, his small form nearly invisible against the green. Emma knelt beside him, close enough to see his hands, but far enough to give him space. A breakfast tray sat forgotten on a nearby bench, the food untouched. Neither of them had noticed it was past noon. Marcus watched his son's hands move, watched Emma respond with signs that flowed like water, natural and unhurried. Watched Gabriel's face cycle through a dozen expressions: excitement, confusion, delight, thoughtful concentration. The boy was having a conversation. An actual, real conversation with someone who understood him, and the difference between this and his interactions with tutors was stark. Professor Hayes was competent, professional. He taught Gabriel vocabulary and grammar the way you'd teach any academic subject. But Emma signed the way someone speaks their native language, with rhythm and nuance, and the kind of casual fluency that said this wasn't translation, it was thinking. Gabriel signed something rapid and complex. Emma actually laughed out loud and signed back. Gabriel's whole body shook with silent laughter, his hands coming up to cover his mouth in a gesture so much like Catherine that Marcus's chest constricted. He should leave, should respect their privacy, return to his study, pretend he hadn't spent half an hour watching his son interact with a palace servant because he couldn't figure out how to interact with the boy himself. But he couldn't move, couldn't look away from the proof that Gabriel wasn't broken, wasn't deficient, wasn't any of the things Marcus had privately feared. The boy was bright and funny and desperate to connect, and the only thing standing between him and a normal childhood was a father too cowardly to learn a new language. The truth settled over Marcus like armor he couldn't remove. Heavy, inescapable, earned through his own failures. Gabriel must have sensed some change in the courtyard's energy, because the boy's head suddenly turned toward the archway. His eyes found Marcus standing in shadow. The laughter died on Gabriel's face. His hands dropped to his sides. His whole posture changed, shoulders curling inward, making himself small. Emma followed Gabriel's gaze. Her eyes went wide when she saw Marcus. She scrambled to her feet, hands twisting together in distress, clearly certain she'd done something wrong by still being here hours after breakfast service should have ended. Marcus stepped into the courtyard. Sunlight hit his face fierce and uncomfortable. Both Emma and Gabriel stared at him like he was a natural disaster approaching, with predictable devastation. He should say something, should explain why he was here, what he wanted, anything to break the awful tension. But words failed him the way they always did around Gabriel. All his eloquence, all his diplomatic training, all the speeches he delivered to thousands of subjects evaporated when faced with one 7-year-old boy who just wanted his father to see him. Emma found her voice first. It came out shaky, apologetic. "Your Majesty, I apologize. I should have finished service hours ago. I was just the prince, had questions about. I didn't mean to overstay." Marcus raised a hand. Emma stopped talking immediately, her face going white with fear. He made himself look at Gabriel, made himself meet those eyes that were so much like Catherine's. It hurt. "I didn't mean to interrupt." His voice came out rougher than intended. Gabriel flinched slightly, then tried to hide it, which somehow made it worse. Marcus had no idea what to do next. He'd spent 300 years conquering kingdoms, and he couldn't figure out how to have a simple conversation with his own son. The absurdity would have been funny if it wasn't so pathetic. Emma was still standing there, frozen in place, probably wondering if she should leave or stay or throw herself on the king's mercy. Gabriel's gaze darted between Marcus and Emma, his small hands twitching like he wanted to sign something, but didn't dare. The silence stretched, became unbearable. Marcus was about to retreat, about to make some excuse and leave them to their conversation when Emma did something unexpected. She signed to Gabriel. Her hands moved in careful, deliberate shapes that Marcus couldn't interpret. Gabriel's eyes widened. He signed back, quick and questioning. Emma nodded and signed again longer, this time her expression gentle. Gabriel looked at Marcus, really looked at him, studying his face with an intensity that made Marcus feel examined under a microscope. Whatever Emma had signed seemed to have given the boy permission for something. Gabriel's hands came up slowly. He formed a simple gesture, fingers pointing at Marcus and then back at himself. His expression was hopeful and terrified in equal measure. Marcus had absolutely no idea what his son had just said. The moment stretched. Gabriel's hands dropped back to his sides. His face shuddered, hope draining away as he realized his father still couldn't understand him. Didn't understand him. Had made no effort to learn in 7 years. Emma's voice was quiet, almost apologetic. "He asked if you wanted to sit with him, Your Majesty." The words hit Marcus like a physical blow. His son was asking permission to spend time with him, asking as if Marcus's company were a gift to be requested rather than a right to be expected. As if 7 years of distance had taught Gabriel that his father's attention had to be earned instead of freely given. Marcus's throat closed around whatever response he had been trying to form. He managed a nod. Gabriel's face brightened slightly cautiously, like someone who'd been burned before and wasn't sure if this time would be different. Emma started to leave, clearly reading this as a dismissal. Marcus's voice stopped her. "Stay." She froze, looked back at him with confusion and lingering fear. Marcus didn't know why he'd asked her to stay, didn't know what he was doing here at all. He just knew that Gabriel had been laughing 5 minutes ago, and the moment Marcus appeared, that laughter had died, and maybe if Emma stayed, it wouldn't be so obvious that Marcus's presence was the problem. He crossed to one of the stone benches and sat. The willow branches hung low enough to brush his shoulders, Catherine's silver leaves catching afternoon light. Gabriel remained on the grass a careful distance away. Emma stood between them, uncertain of her role in whatever this was. Marcus made himself speak, even though his voice felt like it belonged to someone else. "I saw you talking through the archway. I didn't mean to intrude." Gabriel's hands twitched, started to rise. Emma glanced at the boy, then at Marcus, clearly trying to decide if she should translate unsolicited. Marcus solved the problem by asking directly, "What was he saying when I arrived?" Emma's hands fidgeted with her apron. She looked at Gabriel for permission. The boy nodded, though his expression suggested he wasn't sure this was a good idea. Emma's voice was soft, careful. "He was telling me about the birds. There's a family of sparrows that built a nest in the willow tree. He found a fallen nest yesterday and was worried they'd be sad about losing their home. I told him birds are clever, that they'd build a new one. He liked that idea." Marcus felt something crack in his chest. His son was worried about sparrows, was compassionate enough to consider the feelings of birds, thoughtful enough to seek reassurance from someone who'd listen. And Marcus knew none of this. Hadn't asked, hadn't cared enough to learn what occupied his son's thoughts beyond whether the boy was eating properly and obeying his tutors. He forced himself to look at Gabriel again. "Show me the nest." Gabriel blinked, looked at Emma as if to confirm he'd understood correctly. Emma signed something Marcus assumed was translation. Gabriel's face went through several emotions too fast to track, landing on cautious hope. The boy stood and crossed to the willow tree, reached up to retrieve something from where it hung on a low branch, brought it back to Marcus with careful, precious movements. It was a bird's nest, small, woven from twigs and moss and bits of string, scavenged from everywhere. Empty, slightly damaged, but intact enough to show the craftsmanship of whatever bird had built it. Gabriel held it out to Marcus with both hands, an offering. Marcus took it. The nest weighed almost nothing. He studied the construction with the same attention he'd give to military fortifications, noting how the twigs interlocked, how the moss provided insulation, how the whole structure was engineered to protect fragile eggs from wind and weather. "This is well made." He said it to Gabriel, who was watching his face with desperate attention. Emma signed the words. Gabriel's hands moved in response. Emma translated. "He says the birds who made it must have been very dedicated. It takes a long time to build a nest this good." Marcus turned the nest over in his hands. A thought occurred to him, the kind of tactical observation his military mind specialized in. But they abandoned it. Why would they leave something they'd worked so hard to create? Emma signed to Gabriel. The boy's response was longer this time, his hands moving with thoughtful precision. Emma's translation followed. "Sometimes birds have to abandon their nests because of predators or storms. It doesn't mean the nest wasn't good. It just means circumstances changed and they had to adapt. Building a new nest doesn't erase the work they put into the old one." The words landed with unexpected weight. Marcus looked at his son's serious face, wondering if Gabriel knew he was describing more than birds. Describing a mother who died too soon. A father who'd abandoned his responsibilities. A family nest that had fallen apart and never been rebuilt. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable exactly. More like pregnant with things Marcus didn't know how to say, and Gabriel couldn't say out loud, and Emma was too tactful to point out. Marcus set the nest carefully on the bench beside him. "What will you do with it?" Gabriel signed. Emma translated. "Keep it. To remember that beautiful things can exist even if they don't last forever." Something in Marcus's chest broke. Not cracked, broke. Shattered into pieces he didn't know how to reassemble. He stood abruptly, his sudden movement making both Emma and Gabriel flinch. Marcus caught himself, forced his body language to soften, tried to project calm instead of the chaos churning inside him. "I should go. I have council business." It was a lie. He had no council business. He just needed to leave before he said something he'd regret, or worse, something true. Gabriel's face fell. The boy had learned to school his expressions over 7 years of being disappointed, but he wasn't quite fast enough to hide the hurt. Emma looked between them with an expression Marcus couldn't quite read. Pity, maybe, or disappointment in him for failing yet another test he hadn't known he was taking. Marcus made it 3 steps toward the archway before Gabriel's hand touched his arm. He stopped, looked down. His son was tiny next to him, barely tall enough to reach Marcus's elbow, even stretching. Gabriel's hand on his arm was impossibly small, impossibly warm. Human warm, because the boy hadn't inherited vampire cold. Gabriel's free hand moved, forming a simple gesture. One Marcus didn't understand but could read in his son's desperate eyes. Emma's voice was quiet behind them. "He's asking if you'll come back." Marcus looked at Gabriel, at the hope and fear warring across the boy's face, at the evidence that 7 years of absence hadn't killed his son's desire for connection, only taught him not to expect it. The lie would have been easy. Say yes, make a vague promise, leave and then avoid the courtyard for another month while inventing reasons why he was too busy. But Gabriel's hand was still on his arm. Catherine's eyes were still looking up at him from their son's face. And Marcus was suddenly tired of lying, tired of pretending, tired of being the kind of father who'd rather conquer kingdoms than learn to communicate with a child who just wanted to be seen. "Yes, I'll come back." The words came out rough, honest, terrifying in their simplicity. Gabriel's hand squeezed his arm once gently, then released. The boy signed something quick and small. Emma translated without being asked. "Thank you." Marcus nodded. Couldn't trust himself to speak again. He left the courtyard without looking back, but he could feel Gabriel watching him go. The same way he could feel Catherine's ghost judging him from whatever afterlife existed for vampires who'd once been human. Richard found him an hour later in his study staring at intelligence reports without reading them. The old steward set down a tea service Marcus hadn't requested and poured without asking permission. "The morning shift went well, I take it?" Marcus accepted the teacup, grateful for something to do with his hands. Gabriel seems comfortable with her. Richard's expression suggested he knew Marcus was understating dramatically. "Miss Grace has that effect. The staff speak highly of her, even those who resent her sudden promotion. She has a gift for making people feel heard." Marcus drank tea that tasted like ash and regret. Richard, the sign language instruction Gabriel receives. Professor Hayes teaches him 3 times weekly. Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday afternoons, Your Majesty. 2 hours per session. 6 hours a week. Gabriel spent 6 hours a week with someone who could communicate with him in his native language. The rest of the time he was surrounded by people who could speak 7 languages between them, but not the one that mattered. Marcus set down his teacup. Arrange additional sessions. Daily if Hayes is available. Richard nodded, but something in his expression suggested the real question hadn't been asked yet. "Will there be anything else, sire?" Marcus almost dismissed him, almost let the moment pass. But Gabriel's hand on his arm still felt warm, and the nest still sat on the bench where Marcus had left it, and the lie about coming back had somehow transmuted into something like truth. "Professor Hayes, could he teach adults? Or is sign language something you need to learn?" "Young?" Richard's face remained perfectly neutral, but something shifted behind his eyes that might have been hope. "ASL can be learned at any age, Your Majesty. Like any language, fluency requires practice and immersion, but there's no physiological barrier to adult learning. Shall I arrange an introduction?" Marcus picked up the teacup again just to have something to grip that wouldn't break. "Not yet. I'm simply curious about the logistics." It was transparent as glass. Richard was too polite to call him on it. "Of course, sire. I'll make inquiries should you decide to pursue the matter further." After Richard left, Marcus sat alone with his cold tea and his cowardice. The smart thing would be to forget this entire afternoon. Forget Gabriel's hopeful face. Forget the reminder that his son was lonely and Marcus was the reason. Forget that he'd promised to come back and probably wouldn't because avoidance was easier than effort. He pulled out his desk drawer. The portrait of Catherine holding baby Gabriel accused him silently. Marcus spoke to the painting like he'd done 1,000 times before. "I don't know how to do this. I don't know how to be what he needs." The Catherine in the portrait smiled and held their son and didn't answer because she was dead and couldn't save Marcus from himself anymore. He locked the drawer, returned to his intelligence reports, spent the rest of the afternoon pretending to care about Blackthorn troop movements while his mind replayed Gabriel's hands asking if he'd come back, and Marcus's voice promising something he didn't know if he could deliver. The next morning, Marcus woke at dawn with a decision crystallized in his mind. He found Richard before breakfast, before he could talk himself out of it. "Professor Hayes, I want to meet with him today." Richard didn't ask why, just nodded and said he'd arrange it. Hayes arrived at Marcus's study precisely at noon. He was 68 years old human, with the kind of weathered face that suggested a life spent outdoors before age and arthritis drove him indoors to teaching. His hands were gnarled, but moved with practiced grace, signing his greeting even as he spoke it aloud. "Your Majesty, Richard said you wanted to discuss Gabriel's education." Marcus gestured to the chair across from his desk. Hayes sat with the ease of someone comfortable in his own skin, despite sitting across from a being who could tear him apart without effort. Marcus hadn't prepared a speech, didn't know how to explain that he'd spent 7 years avoiding his son and had finally realized avoidance had an expiration date. "Tell me about sign language, American Sign Language specifically. How long does it take to become conversational?" Hayes folded his hands in his lap, studying Marcus with eyes that had probably seen through better liars. "That depends on the student's dedication and natural aptitude. With intensive study, basic conversational fluency can be achieved in 6 months to a year. True fluency, the kind where you think in the language rather than translating, takes years. But Gabriel wouldn't expect perfection, Your Majesty. He'd simply appreciate the effort. The old man was being diplomatic, but his meaning was clear. Marcus had spent 7 years not trying. Any effort at all would be improvement. Marcus leaned back in his chair, studying the professor. If I were to begin learning, how would you recommend I start? Hayes's expression softened with something that looked like relief. The fundamentals are straightforward. The ASL alphabet, basic vocabulary, simple sentence structures. The challenge isn't intellectual so much as cultural. ASL isn't just hand gestures. It's facial expressions, body language, spatial grammar. It requires vulnerability in communication that many hearing people find uncomfortable. Vulnerability. Marcus had conquered kingdoms through strength, negotiated treaties through careful emotional control, built a reputation as a warrior who never showed weakness. And now a 68-year-old human was telling him that talking to his son required the one thing Marcus had spent 3 centuries learning to suppress. I've mastered 7 languages, Marcus said, hearing the defensiveness in his voice. I can learn an 8th. Hayes nodded, but his eyes said he knew those other languages hadn't required Marcus to change who he was, only what he could say. With your permission, Your Majesty, I could begin instruction immediately. Short daily sessions would be more effective than longer weekly ones. Consistency matters more than duration. Marcus pulled out his schedule. Council meetings, military briefings, diplomatic sessions, 100 obligations that had felt crucial an hour ago and now seemed like excuses. Dawn, before council business begins. 30 minutes daily. Hayes inclined his head in acceptance. We'll start tomorrow if that suits Your Majesty. I'll prepare introductory materials. Marcus nodded dismissal. Hayes stood to leave, then paused at the door. If I may speak freely, sire, Marcus gestured permission. Gabriel is a remarkable child, bright, compassionate, desperately lonely, but he's also resilient. Children forgive more readily than we deserve. It's not too late. The old professor left before Marcus could respond, which was probably wise since Marcus had no response prepared. The words settled over him like a benediction he hadn't earned and a challenge he wasn't sure he could meet. It's not too late, but it felt late. It felt like he'd already missed 7 years of his son's life. 7 years Catherine would have filled with laughter and stories and the kind of effortless connection Marcus had forgotten how to feel. 7 years of Gabriel learning that silence was safer than hoping his father might answer. Marcus spent the afternoon in council meetings that dragged like combat without the clarity of knowing who the enemy was. Border tensions, trade disputes, internal politics that required his attention and offered no satisfaction. Theodore watched him from across the conference table with an expression that said he'd noticed something had shifted, but couldn't identify what. Let him wonder. Marcus wasn't ready to explain that he'd decided to learn sign language because a waitress had made his son laugh, and Marcus wanted to know what that sounded like in a language Gabriel could speak. The council session ended near 5 p.m. Marcus returned to his study and found a package waiting on his desk. No note, but he recognized Richard's efficient organization. Inside were 3 books on American Sign Language basics, a DVD set of instructional videos that Marcus didn't have equipments to play, and a laminated card showing the ASL alphabet with hand positions clearly illustrated. Marcus studied the card, 26 letters each represented by a specific hand shape. Some were intuitive, others looked identical to his untrained eye. He tried forming the letter A. His fingers felt clumsy, too large warrior's hands that knew sword grips and trigger pulls, but not the delicate precision required to make meaning from empty air. He practiced anyway. A, B, C, got stuck on D because his thumb wouldn't cooperate. Started over. Made it to F before frustration made him slam the card down harder than intended. This shouldn't be difficult. He'd learned Mandarin in 6 months, had picked up enough Arabic to negotiate treaties, had command of Latin, French, Spanish, German, and enough Russian to follow military communications. But those languages had been intellectual exercises, tools for conquest and diplomacy. This was different. This required admitting he'd failed, his son required vulnerability. Hayes had warned about required accepting that 7 years of avoiding the problem had only made it worse. Marcus picked up the card again. Started over. A through Z, slow and deliberate until muscle memory began to form. His hands felt awkward and the shape still looked wrong, but he could spell his name. Could spell Gabriel's name, letter by letter, slower than speech, but faster than silence. It was something, not enough, but something. He practiced until his hands cramped, went to bed near midnight, and lay awake thinking about tomorrow's lesson with Hayes, wondering if Gabriel would notice, wondering if the boy would care that his father was finally trying, or if 7 years had taught him not to hope. Marcus didn't sleep. Watched dawn paint his windows gray while his hands practiced letters under the covers like a guilty secret. Hayes arrived at 6 a.m. sharp carrying a worn leather briefcase and looking far too alert for someone who probably woke at 5 to make the drive from town. Marcus had cleared his desk of everything except coffee and a notepad. The study felt different at dawn, softer somehow, without the weight of accumulated daylight pressing through the windows. The professor set his briefcase on the desk and pulled out materials with the efficiency of someone who'd done this 1,000 times. We'll start with the alphabet. You've already been practicing, I see. Marcus's hands had moved involuntarily to form the letter A. He forced them still. I tried. I'm not confident in my accuracy. Hayes smiled. Show me what you have. Marcus spelled his name, slowly checking the reference card between letters. Hayes watched without interrupting his expression, patient. Not bad. Your hand positions are close. The main issue is his tension. You're gripping each letter like it might escape. ASL requires fluidity. Think of it as music rather than mathematics. Music. Marcus had no musical talent whatsoever. Catherine had played piano beautifully. Marcus could barely keep rhythm. Hayes must have read his expression. Perhaps a better analogy. You've trained in combat, yes, hand to hand. Marcus nodded. He'd mastered 6 martial arts systems over 3 centuries. Could kill a man 17 ways with bare hands. Then think of signing as a kata. Each letter is a stance. Flow between them rather than forcing the transitions. Your muscle memory will adapt. That made sense. Marcus tried again, letting his hands relax, imagining the alphabet as a combat form. The letters came easier this time, more fluid, still awkward, but less aggressive. Hayes nodded approval. Good. Now let's add context. Sign language isn't just spelling. Most communication uses conceptual signs rather than fingerspelling every word. We'll start with basic vocabulary. The next 20 minutes were a blur of new information. Hayes demonstrated signs for common words. Father, son, hello, thank you, please, sorry. Each one required not just hand position, but facial expression, body language, the vulnerability Hayes had warned about. Marcus felt like he was learning to walk again. Every gesture felt foreign. His face didn't want to cooperate, trained too long to show nothing to keep emotion locked behind the mask of command. Hayes was patient, correcting without judgment, explaining the why behind each movement. In ASL, the face carries grammatical information. A statement versus a question can be conveyed entirely through expression. Gabriel will be watching your whole body when you sign, not just your hands. Marcus tried the sign for son again this time, letting his expression soften the way Hayes demonstrated. It felt exposed, vulnerable, exactly the kind of openness he'd spent 3 centuries avoiding. Better, Hayes said. Remember, you're not performing for an audience. You're communicating with Gabriel. He doesn't need perfection. He needs sincerity. The lesson ended at 6:30. Marcus's hands ached from unfamiliar positions. His face felt strange from making expressions he normally suppressed. But he could sign 15 words and spell his son's name without checking the reference card. Hayes packed his materials with the satisfaction of a teacher who'd found a student worth teaching. Practice what we covered today. Tomorrow we'll build on these foundations. And Your Majesty, don't be discouraged by how difficult this feels. You're not just learning a language, you're learning a new way of existing in the world. That takes time. After Hayes left, Marcus sat alone in his study and practiced the 15 words until they felt less like foreign objects and more like tools he might someday use with confidence. Father, son, hello, thank you. Simple words, insufficient words, but more than he'd been able to say yesterday. Marcus went to his council meeting at 8 a.m. and couldn't focus on anything being discussed. His mind kept drifting to hand positions, facial expressions, the reminder that he'd just committed to daily lessons in something he might fail at spectacularly. Theodore cornered him after the session, his weathered face creased with concern. "You seem distracted today." Marcus gathered his papers, not meeting his old friend's eyes. "Border tensions are escalating. I'm considering our options." Theodore didn't buy it. Decades of friendship made him resistant to Marcus's deflection tactics. "I've seen you strategize through worse situations without breaking concentration. This is something else." Marcus snapped his folder shut harder than necessary. "I'm fine, drop it." Theodore studied him with the kind of attention that had made him Marcus's most valuable advisor and sometimes most irritating friend. "Does this have anything to do with the waitress you promoted to Gabriel's detail? The one who signed to him at the banquet?" Marcus felt his jaw tighten. Palace gossip traveled faster than he'd anticipated. "Personnel decisions aren't council business." Theodore's expression softened into something Marcus didn't want to identify as pity. "You're trying, aren't you, with Gabriel? You're finally trying." The statement hit harder than an accusation would have. Marcus forced himself to meet Theodore's gaze. "Is that a problem?" Theodore shook his head slowly. "No, it's overdue. I'm just concerned about what happens when you realize learning sign language doesn't fix 7 years of absence." Marcus felt anger flash hot and immediate. "I'm aware I've failed him. I don't need you cataloging my shortcomings." Theodore held his ground, refusing to back down despite Marcus's fury. "I'm not trying to hurt you. I'm trying to prepare you for the fact that Gabriel might not trust this change. Children who have been disappointed learn to protect themselves. He might not believe you'll stick with it." The words landed like blows. Marcus knew Theodore was right, knew his son had every reason to expect this effort would evaporate, like all Marcus's previous promises, to be more present, more involved, more of a father than a distant king. But knowing it and accepting it were different things. Marcus's voice came out cold final. "I'll worry about my relationship with my son. You worry about the border tensions." He left before Theodore could respond. Spent the rest of the day avoiding everyone, hiding in his study practicing sign language until his hands cramped and his face ached from unfamiliar expressions. 2 days passed in a blur of dawn lessons with Hayes and afternoons trying to apply what he'd learned. Marcus could now sign basic phrases, could introduce himself, could ask simple questions, could express gratitude and apology in gestures that still felt foreign but were becoming familiar. Hayes pushed him harder, each session adding vocabulary, correcting subtle errors Marcus didn't know he was making. The professor had infinite patience for mistakes, but zero tolerance for half efforts. "Again," Hayes would say when Marcus's hand position was slightly wrong. "The difference between mother and father is just thumb placement. Gabriel will notice if you sign it incorrectly." Marcus would practice until he got it right, until the movements became muscle memory, until he could sign without thinking about each individual finger's position. On the third morning, Hayes introduced something new. "Today we're going to practice conversation. I'll sign to you, you respond. Don't worry about perfection. Focus on comprehension." Hayes's hands moved. Marcus caught maybe half the signs, enough to piece together a question about weather. He signed back his best guess at an appropriate response. Hayes corrected his hand position, and they tried again. It was frustrating, humbling. Everything Marcus had spent 3 centuries avoiding. He wanted to quit a dozen times during that 30-minute session. Wanted to throw something and walk away and pretend this whole experiment had been a mistake. But Gabriel's face kept appearing in his mind. The way his son had looked at the banquet when Emma signed to him. The transformation from invisible to seen in the space between heartbeats. Marcus wanted that. Wanted to be the one who made his son feel visible. Wanted to earn back 7 years of connection he had thrown away because grief had been easier than effort. So he stayed, practiced, failed, practiced it again. Got better slowly, incrementally, in ways that didn't feel like progress until Hayes pointed them out. "You're improving rapidly," the professor said at the end of the 3rd lesson. "Most students take weeks to reach this level of comprehension." Marcus flexed his aching hands. "I'm motivated." Hayes's expression suggested he understood exactly what motivated a king to wake at dawn and practice vocabulary like a first-year student. "Have you signed to Gabriel yet?" The question hit harder than expected. No, I'm not ready. Hayes packed his materials with deliberate care. Respectfully, Your Majesty, you'll never feel ready. Waiting for perfection means waiting forever. Gabriel would rather have imperfect communication now than perfect silence indefinitely. The words stuck with Marcus long after Hayes left. Would rather have imperfect communication now. It should have been obvious. Should have been the conclusion Marcus reached on his own 7 years ago, instead of hiding behind excuses about being too busy, too important, too broken by grief to learn his son's language. Marcus spent that afternoon in a military planning session that required his full attention and received maybe 40%. The Blackthorn situation was escalating. Victor had requested a formal meeting, which meant either genuine diplomatic overture or elaborate setup for something worse. Marcus should have been planning contingencies, wargaming scenarios, preparing for every possible outcome. Instead, his mind kept drifting to the eastern courtyard, wondering if Emma was there with Gabriel, wondering what they talked about, what stories his son told when he thought no one important was listening. The meeting ended without Marcus contributing anything useful. He dismissed his advisors and sat alone in the war room, staring at maps that meant nothing and trying to figure out when he'd become the kind of leader who couldn't focus on existential threats because he was too busy thinking about a conversation with his 7-year-old son that terrified him more than actual combat. Richard found him there near 6 p.m. looking patient and concerned in equal measure. "Dinner is being served, Your Majesty. Shall I have a tray sent up?" Marcus shook his head. "Where does Gabriel eat? He doesn't join me for dinner." Richard's expression suggested this was a test with an obvious answer. Marcus kept failing. "The prince takes his evening meal in his courtyard, weather permitting. He prefers dining outdoors." Of course, Gabriel ate alone. Marcus had never bothered to establish different arrangements, had never asked if his son might want company, might prefer family meals to solitary dinners, watched over by servants who couldn't understand his conversation. Marcus stood before he could talk himself out of it. "Have my dinner sent to the eastern courtyard. I'll eat with Gabriel tonight." Richard's face remained perfectly neutral, but something in his eyes looked like victory. "Of course, sire. I'll inform the kitchens immediately." Marcus made it halfway to the eastern wing before panic set in. What was he doing? He couldn't even hold a basic conversation in ASL yet. Gabriel would try to sign and Marcus would fumble through responses, proving yet again that his father couldn't be bothered to actually learn his language properly. But turning back felt worse than going forward. Felt like 7 more years of avoiding the problem. Felt like the kind of cowardice Marcus had spent his life pretending he didn't possess. The courtyard door stood open. Marcus stopped just outside exactly as he had 3 days ago, watching through the archway before committing to entry. Gabriel sat on his usual spot on the grass legs, folded dinner tray beside him. He was eating slowly, mechanically, the way people eat when food is fuel rather than pleasure. The boy's attention was fixed on something in his lap. Marcus squinted to see what it was. The bird's nest. Gabriel was still carrying it around, examining it with the same careful attention he had shown when Marcus had visited before. Marcus stepped into the courtyard. Gabriel's head came up immediately, his expression cycling through surprise, confusion, and careful caution. The boy set down his fork and clasped his hands in his lap, prepared to be polite and distant because that's what 7 years had taught him his father expected. Marcus crossed to the stone bench and sat. His dinner tray appeared moments later, carried by a servant, who set it down and vanished with practiced efficiency. Father and son sat in silence. Not the comfortable silence of people who didn't need words. The awkward silence of 2 people who didn't know how to bridge the gap between them. Marcus should say something, should explain why he was here, what he wanted, anything to break the tension. But his voice felt locked behind years of practiced distance. Gabriel's hands twitched, started to rise, then drop back down. The boy had learned not to bother signing when his audience couldn't understand. Marcus made himself try, made his hands move through the sign Hayes had taught him 3 days ago. "Hello." It was clumsy. His hand position was probably wrong. His facial expression definitely was. But it was something, an attempt, a bridge extended even if it couldn't bear much weight yet. Gabriel's eyes went huge. His mouth opened slightly in shock. For a long moment, he just stared at Marcus like he'd witnessed something impossible. Then Gabriel's hands flew up, moving so fast Marcus couldn't follow. The boy was signing a rapid stream of what looked like questions, his face cycling through excitement and disbelief. Marcus's hands moved through the sign for slow that Hayes had taught him yesterday. Gabriel stopped, took a breath, signed again slower this time, enunciating each gesture the way you'd speak clearly to someone learning your language. Marcus caught maybe half of it. Something about father learning to sign a question about whether this was real. He tried to respond. His hands fumbled through the signs for yes and learning and sorry in no particular grammatical order. It was probably nonsense. Probably looked like a toddler's first attempts at communication. But Gabriel's face transformed. The same brilliant smile from the banquet, the same light in his eyes that Marcus had been chasing since the moment he'd seen it 3 days ago. His son signed something Marcus didn't understand. Then again, slower, his small face patient and encouraging. Marcus had to fingerspell his response letter by letter because he didn't know enough vocabulary yet. I don't understand yet. Gabriel nodded. His hands moved through a simple sign that Marcus recognized from yesterday's lesson. Thank you. They sat in silence again, but this time it felt different. Less like failure and more like the beginning of something fragile that might grow into connection if Marcus didn't destroy it through neglect or cowardice. Marcus picked up his fork. Gabriel did the same. They ate dinner together while the sun set behind the courtyard walls and painted everything gold. The same color Catherine had loved, the same color she'd wanted their son to wake up to every morning. Gabriel finished first, set down his fork and signed something to Marcus. Marcus shook his head. Slow. Gabriel repeated the sign carefully. Marcus still didn't recognize it. He'd have to ask Hayes tomorrow, add it to his vocabulary list, learn it along with the 100 other words he needed to have actual conversations instead of these painful fragments. But for now, sitting here with his son, watching Gabriel's patient face as he tried to communicate with a father who was finally belatedly attempting to learn his language, it felt like the first real thing Marcus had done in 7 years. They stayed in the courtyard until full dark. Didn't talk much, couldn't talk much given Marcus's limitations. But Gabriel pulled out his collection of interesting stones and showed them to Marcus one by one, signing descriptions that Marcus mostly couldn't follow, but nodded at anyway. It was imperfect, inadequate, exactly what Hayes had warned about. But it was effort, and Gabriel seemed to recognize it as such, seemed willing to accept imperfect communication over perfect silence. When Marcus finally left near 9 p.m., Gabriel signed what looked like good night. Marcus signed back probably incorrectly, but the meaning got across. Walking back to his study, Marcus felt something he hadn't felt in years. Not happiness exactly, more like the absence of the crushing guilt that had become so familiar he'd stopped noticing it. He practiced sign language until midnight, fell asleep in his chair with reference cards scattered across his desk, and woke at dawn with new determination. The lessons with Hayes continued. Week 1 became week 2. Marcus's vocabulary expanded. His comprehension improved. He could follow simple conversations, now could respond in grammatically incorrect but understandable ASL, could actually communicate with his son in halting imperfect exchanges that meant everything. He started joining Gabriel for dinner most nights. Started visiting the courtyard, not because he felt obligated, but because Gabriel would show him new discoveries. A particularly interesting rock, a bird. He'd seen a story from a book his tutors had been reading with him. Emma was there sometimes, signing with the Gabriel in rapid exchanges Marcus couldn't yet follow. She'd retreat when Marcus arrived, giving father and son space, but Marcus had started asking her to stay. Started asking her to translate when Gabriel signed something too complex for Marcus's limited vocabulary. She'd been hesitant at first, clearly uncertain of her role. But Gabriel had seemed to relax when she was there, seemed more willing to sign freely instead of carefully controlling his communication to match his father's limited understanding. The three of them developed a routine. Emma would deliver breakfast, stay to talk with Gabriel. Marcus would join them some mornings practicing conversation, fumbling through responses, learning. It should have felt strange. A king, his son, and a 22-year-old waitress sitting in a courtyard talking about birds and books and whether the moon was actually made of cheese like the old stories said. But it felt more real than anything Marcus had done in years. Theodore noticed the change, of course, commented on it during a council session in week 3. You seem more present lately. Marcus glanced up from the treaty revision they were supposed to be reviewing. I'm always present. Theodore's expression said he knew better. More engaged then, less like you're going through motions while your mind is elsewhere. Marcus returned his attention to the treaty. The Blackthorn situation had shifted from concerning to actively dangerous. Victor was mobilizing in ways that suggested genuine military intent rather than posturing. I'm focused on what matters. Theodore let the conversation drop, but Marcus felt his friend's eyes on him throughout the rest of the session, assessing, calculating, probably planning another lecture about expectations and disappointment. Let him plan. Marcus had spent 3 weeks learning to communicate with his son and wasn't about to stop because Theodore thought it was too little too late. That afternoon, Marcus found himself in the Royal Library, a room he hadn't visited in years. Catherine had loved this place, had spent hours here reading everything from philosophy to poetry to technical manuals on gardening. The library had been her sanctuary, and after her death, Marcus had avoided it like all the other spaces that reminded him too much of what he'd lost. But Gabriel had mentioned it during dinner last night, had signed about the stories in the picture books about how much he loved the library's smell and the way sunlight came through the stained glass windows. Had asked tentatively if Marcus might want to see it sometime. So here Marcus stood, surrounded by floor-to-ceiling shelves and the musty scent of old paper. The library was magnificent in the way vampire architecture tended to be excessive, dramatic, built to impress rather than function. 3 stories tall, connected by spiral staircases and narrow bridges. Stained glass windows depicting scenes from vampire mythology. Reading alcoves tucked into corners where you could hide from the world for hours. Marcus heard voices from the children's section. Not voices exactly. Laughter. The sound drew him forward until he could see into the alcove. Emma and Gabriel sat on the floor surrounded by picture books. Emma was signing a story, her hands moving in elaborate gestures that painted pictures in the air. Gabriel watched with rapt attention, occasionally signing questions. Emma would answer and continue the story, her expressions exaggerated and delightful. Marcus stayed in the doorway watching. This was what he'd missed. 7 years of stories and laughter, and the simple joy of a child being understood by someone who spoke his language. Emma must have sensed his presence because she looked up mid-sign. Her hands froze. Gabriel followed her gaze and saw Marcus standing there. The boy's immediate reaction was to tense, to pull back, to prepare for whatever judgment his father might deliver. But then something shifted in Gabriel's expression. He signed something to Emma. She glanced at Marcus, then back at Gabriel, then nodded. Gabriel stood and crossed to Marcus, took his hand with small, warm fingers, tugged him into the alcove. Marcus let himself be led, sat down on the floor next to the scattered books, his formal council clothes entirely inappropriate for sitting cross-legged on dusty library carpet. Gabriel picked up one of the books and handed it to Marcus, signed something that Marcus mostly understood. Story, please. Emma's voice translated what he'd missed. He wants you to tell the story. Marcus looked at the book in his hands, a picture book about a dragon who couldn't breathe fire. The kind of simple children's story that probably had layers of meaning if you bothered to look for them. I can't sign well enough to tell a story. Gabriel signed again. Emma translated. He says you can try. He'll help. Marcus opened the book. The illustrations were beautiful, detailed paintings of a small dragon standing alone while other dragons breathed fire around him. The text was simple enough a child could read it. Marcus started to read aloud, then stopped. Gabriel couldn't hear him. Reading aloud defeated the entire purpose. He looked at Emma helplessly. Show me the signs for the main words. I'll try to tell him. Emma's expression softened. She guided him through the vocabulary. Dragon, fire, alone, friend, different, strong. Marcus fumbled through the story, fingerspelling words he didn't know, signing the ones he'd learned, making countless mistakes that Gabriel gently corrected. It took 3 times longer than reading aloud would have taken. His hands cramped. His face ached from maintaining expression. But Gabriel watched him with complete focus, his small face following every gesture, every attempt. When Marcus finally reached the end, the dragon discovering he could breathe wind instead of fire, using it to spread flower petals instead of destruction, Gabriel clapped his hands in silent applause, then threw his arms around Marcus's neck. The hug caught Marcus completely off guard. Gabriel's small body was warm against him, trust evident in every line of his posture. The boy was shaking slightly, and Marcus realized with devastating clarity that his son was crying. Silently, the way he did everything, tears soaking into Marcus's collar. Marcus's arms came up to hold Gabriel. One hand cradled the back of his son's head. The gesture automatic, protective, something he'd done when Gabriel was an infant and had forgotten how to do since. I've got you, Marcus said, knowing Gabriel couldn't hear, but hoping somehow the meaning carried anyway. Emma's voice was soft. He's been waiting a long time for this. Marcus held his son, who felt 7 years of distance collapse into this single moment. Felt the weight of Catherine's ghost watching and maybe finally approving. Felt the first real crack in the armor he'd built around his heart to keep grief contained. They stayed like that until Gabriel's tears stopped. Until the boy pulled back and signed something Emma didn't need to translate because Marcus finally understood it on his own. I love you. Marcus's hands moved through the sign he'd practiced 1,000 times in private, terrified he'd never have the courage to use it in front of his son. I love you too. It was imperfect. His hand position was probably slightly wrong. His facial expression probably didn't convey the depth of feeling he was trying to communicate. But it was real, and Gabriel understood it, and that was enough. Emma quietly excused herself, leaving father and son alone in the library alcove with picture books scattered around them, and 7 years of silence finally beginning to break. They stayed until dinner. Marcus told 3 more stories, getting better each time, his signing becoming more fluid as muscle memory and desperation combined into something approaching communication. Gabriel talked about the books he loved, about the characters he identified with, about stories where the different ones found their strength and the lonely ones found their families. And Marcus listened. Actually listened not just to the words, but to what his son wasn't signing. The loneliness Gabriel had been carrying. The fear that his difference made him unworthy. The desperate hope that maybe his father would someday see him. When they finally left the library, walking side by side through corridors lit by evening light, Marcus made a decision. The spring procession was 3 weeks away. Ancient tradition demanded the royal family appear before their people. For 7 years, Marcus had kept Gabriel hidden, had treated his son's existence as something to be managed rather than celebrated. Not this year. This year, Gabriel would stand beside him on that balcony. This year, the kingdom would see their prince not as a silent shadow, but as the heir to the Thornfield throne. And if that terrified Marcus more than any battle he'd fought in 300 years, well, courage wasn't the absence of fear. It was being scared and doing it anyway. He just had to figure out how to prepare Gabriel for public scrutiny when he'd barely figured out how to have a private conversation with him.